After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, Rossolimo is on the board, and in this specific line with d6, white takes the knight, takes back, and then e5. Often the black player takes the pawn in e5. This is a real line, and there's quite a few players who are prepared about this. Um, why would black give up the pawn structure and just double up and isolate his own pawns? The reason is that after knight takes back, which is the best move, black plays queen to d5, threatening g2, threatening the knight, and also the knight will be taken with check. So idea of queen f3 for c6, pressure on c6 doesn't work because of the check. Well, the knight has to come back. Now black continues with queen e4 check. So queen e2 isn't the best move because that drops a pawn, and also the d pawn would be isolated. Black would be up a pawn. Although to be fair, the game is kind of messy, but that's kind of slightly better for black. So king f1 is the best move. And after bishop to g4, there's too much pressure on the knight is pinned, so black will inevitably be able to also break the pawn structure of the white player and double up and isolate these pawns. Best move by white now is d3, attacking the queen, and after bishop takes knight, of course this has to be taken back, otherwise black goes up a piece. Best move is to take with the queen, queen takes, pawn takes, and now both players have a double isolated pawn. The difference is though that white's development can be achieved easier, and with a few accurate moves, white should be able to play a good endgame. So after e6, black will have to start developing the pieces, so the bishop has to go. It is not recommended to develop the bishop from the fianchetto because white will play bishop e3, will put pressure on the pawn, and the bishop will not be able to, the black bishop will not be able to abandon this diagonal that goes to c5. And also pushing the pawn to c4 doesn't make any sense because it just gets taken for free. So after e6, bishop e3, now knight f6, black will have to develop the pieces. White continues with knight to d2, and all we're doing is go for this weakness. So now knight d5 is not recommendable for black because if black is going there for the sake of taking the bishop, that will unite the pawns of the white player, and then white's got an open file. It will be piling up the rooks. They will be putting pressure on g7, preventing the natural development of the black bishop, and white will go to a better endgame. So after bishop e7 and rook to g1 and black castling, white continues with bishop h6. If instead of castling, black would have just defended the pawn in g7 by pushing it, then this doesn't work because of knight b3 putting pressure on c5. There's too much pressure of it. c4 would be taken. So, and after knight to d7, furthering protecting the pawn in c5, white will play rook to g4, and nothing stopped white from playing rook to c4 and winning the pawn, and then go to a winning endgame. So back in this position, instead of g7, if black castles, as mentioned, bishop h6 is the move. And now after knight to h5, protecting the g7 pawn, which couldn't be pushed because of the pin. All of these moves so far have been forced. They forced the reply. Unless black wants to play a mistake, and then in that case white will just go up and increase the advantage even more. So after knight h5, bishop g5, here it's favorable to swap the bishops because the rook will be coming with a fork. So it's pointless to look at bishop g5 and then this move, which just it gives an endgame too easy. So the moves could be knight back to f6, but then knight e4, and now it's game over. There's too much pressure on this knight, and when the knight moves, well, taking in e4 will force the black player to admit that the whole line where he purposely doubled up and isolated his pawns in exchange of the same thing from white has become pointless because knight takes and then pawn takes back. White loses, white gets a better pawn structure for the endgame, and besides, the pawn in c5 will be the reason why white wins. If knight goes to d5 to defend the bishop, then bishop to h6. And now it's too late to go back to f6 with the knight because of the threat in g7, and the bishop here wouldn't do much because the same thing, the bishop, the pawn g7 is pinned. so the white can easily take the bishop. So in this position, knight f6 is no good. If instead black plays bishop to f6, then the best move by white is rook to b1, protecting the b2 pawn. And after rook f to b8, best move by black, white continues with bishop e3. And after rook takes, bishop takes, rook g5 allows the arrival of the rook into the game. And after the knight moves, rook to c5 gives white much better chances to win the endgame. So in this position, knight f6 and bishop f6 all lose. After f6 instead, white's best move is bishop e3. Of course, the idea is to keep pressuring the c5 pawn. And the funny thing is that the the reason why this double isolated pawn is very good for white is that white has the bishop on the same color of this pawn, whereas black's bishop is on a different color of this f3 pawn. Therefore, the black bishop will have less possibilities to be able to pressurize the f3 pawn. So we can just leave it there forever. After best move rook f to b8, white continues with b3, preventing the arrival of the rook on the second rank. And now this knight really has no squares to go to. Best move by black is f5, idea of getting the knight to play. And white continues with knight to c4. White should win this endgame because of the weakness of the pressure that eventually this pawn in c5 will fall, and also the backwards e6 pawn. And even if black hadn't played a move like f5 and made this e6 pawn weak, even if he had played something like g6 to get the knight the other way, it would have taken the knight so long to get into the game, and it would have wasted a lot of tempos. So after f4, now it looks like the black player was able to reduce the pressure on the square c5 because the white bishop is gone. But after knight f6, so as I mentioned in every video, there's plenty of moves that can happen. It could be like a5, a6, just to say random moves, king f7. Either way, the plan is inevitable because we're going to be working on the weaknesses. Knight f6 is met by rook e1, the attacks a very weak square, and king f7 will be met, for example, by knight e5. You just gotta work it out as the game goes. What matters the most is to understand what are the weaknesses for each opening and how to work to punish them.